In 1883, a journalist named Lafcadio Hearn sailed 30 miles south of New Orleans and found something that had been there for 50 years. A self-governing Filipino fishing village in the Louisiana Marsh, invisible to every map, unreached by the mail, never visited by any official from the state of Louisiana or the United States government. He wrote about it as if he had discovered something. He hadn't. The Manilamen had been there the whole time. Hearn had sailed through 2 days of what he described as a wilderness of swamp grass and miles of absolute desolation to find houses on stilts, over the water, built by Filipino men who had been building their lives in that marsh since at least the 1830s, nearly 50 years, invisible to the map. In his opening paragraphs he wrote, "The place of their lacustrine village is not precisely mentioned upon maps, and the world in general ignored until a few days ago the bare fact of their amphibious existence. Even the United States mail service has never found its way thither. The phrase that reorganized everything for me was not the 50 years. It was the world in general ignored. Not, did not know, ignored." Hearn was describing not a gap in the record, but a direction of attention, and what the Manilamen had understood about that direction from the very beginning. That if you built your village somewhere the dominant world had no interest in looking, the dominant world would not look. What I want to trace in this video is the full shape of what they built and what the record decided not to see. Why Filipino sailors were jumping ship in New Orleans. What they constructed in that swamp that the official record spent a century not recording. The women they married, the industry they invented, the social club they founded 5 years after the Civil War, and the architecture that lines the Louisiana coast to this day. And what it means that the first known article about Filipinos in an American publication was published in 1883 about a community that had already been there for 50 years. To understand why Filipino sailors were jumping off ships in New Orleans, you need to understand the world they were jumping off of. The Manila Galleon trade ran from 1565 to 1815, 250 years. The longest commercial maritime route in history. Enormous ships carried silver from Mexico across 9,000 miles of open Pacific Ocean to Manila. They returned loaded with Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. The sailors who made this crossing were predominantly Filipino, recruited, pressed into service, and subjected to documented violence by Spanish officers. Michael Salgarolo, a New York University historian who studies the Manilamen, framed it directly. These were poor folks from a colonized nation that did not have a lot of options available to them. They deserted in busy ports wherever they could. New Orleans was a busy port. What made Louisiana specifically possible, and this is the part of the story that most accounts either miss or understate, goes deeper than geography. When the first Filipinos came to Louisiana in the mid-18th century, both the Philippines and the Louisiana Territory were under the control of Spain. The Manilamen spoke Spanish, the language of their colonizers. They were Catholic, the religion Spain had imposed on the Philippines. When they crossed from one Spanish colony into another, they carried the empire's own markers of belonging: Spanish administration, Spanish language, Spanish Catholicism. The infrastructure built to control them became the camouflage under which they disappeared. The Spanish officers did not follow them into the alligator swamp, because the alligator swamp was not a place anyone with better options would go. There is something worth sitting with about that logic. Colonialism gave these men two things, a language and a religion that were not originally theirs. And those two things, the empire's own tools, were precisely what allowed them to vanish from the empire's sight. They used the colonizer's gifts to escape the colonizer. It is one of the more efficient reversals in the history of maritime desertion. What they built in that swamp is one of the most extraordinary acts of community construction in American history. The Manilamen lived in small houses supported above the water by stilts, a design structurally identical to the Nipa huts of the Philippine coast. They had rebuilt the Philippines in Louisiana, not metaphorically, architecturally. The stilt houses of San Malo were the same design logic as the houses they had grown up in, built from different materials: palmetto instead of bamboo, woven cane, windows draped with netting against the mosquitoes. According to Hearn, the fishermen slept at night among barrels of flour and folded sails and smoked fish. By the 1880s, the community of over 150 fishermen at San Malo was the largest fishing village on the southern shore of Lake Borgne. Entirely self-governing, entirely invisible to the tax collector, never visited by a government official, building their lives in the one ecosystem that Southeast Asian fishermen and 19th century American officials agreed had nothing worth claiming. And then there was the second village. At the turn of the century, in nearby Barataria Bay, A group of Filipinos built Manila Village, raised structures on stilts above the water with a giant drying platform for shrimp that may have been as large as 2 football fields. Local fisherman Quintin de la Cruz spearheaded its construction. At its peak, Manila Village had a seasonal population of over 200 people during shrimp season and was exporting dried shrimp to Asia, Canada, South America, and Central America, a global trade operation run by Filipino fishermen from platforms in the Louisiana Marsh, exporting to 4 continents. There is no monument to Quintin de la Cruz. There is no mention of Manila Village in most Louisiana history curricula. The scale of what the Manilamen built and the scale of its historical absence do not fit in the same sentence easily. At what point does leaving a story out of the official record stop being oversight and start being a choice? Drop your read in the comments. I have been thinking about this since I first read through the documented export records, and I do not have a clean answer. The community the Manilamen built was extraordinary. The law then introduced a problem with no solution. The Page Act of 1875 effectively barred Asian women from entering the United States. The men who had built villages, an industry, and a self-governing community were legally prohibited from bringing wives or daughters from the Philippines. Their families in Manila received the money they sent home across the Pacific. They would never see the Bayou, so the Manilamen did what people who want to build a future always do. They married the women around them. Isleño women, the Canary Island Spanish settlers planted in Louisiana as a colonial buffer, Cajun women from the surrounding parishes, indigenous women from local tribes, and Irish immigrants. In 1849, a Filipino sailor named Felipe Madriaga married Bridget Nugent at Saint-Malo. They eventually ran a small restaurant together in the Louisiana Bayou, a Filipino man and his Irish wife in the 19th century in the Marsh. Their 6th-generation descendant, Rhonda Richoux, still lives in St. Bernard Parish today. She has written about growing up without feeling out of place. With her Cajun name Richoux and her brown skin, with Cajun and Filipino-American relatives in the same house exchanging recipes and family stories about Felipe and Bridget. That is a 6th-generation continuous thread of memory running from an 1849 marriage in a stilt house over the Louisiana Marsh to a living person in St. Bernard Parish today. The children those marriages produced ran into a wall that the law had built before they were born. Louisiana under Jim Crow operated on a racial binary, white and colored. There was no category for the child of a Filipino father and a Cajun mother. Census takers wrote down what they saw. If the child looked white, white. If darker, colored. If Mediterranean, Italian, or Spanish. The administrative act of classifying a child by appearance rather than parentage is not a neutral data collection decision. It is a decision about which half of that child's identity the record will preserve. Across enough generations, the Filipino half simply stopped appearing in the official record, not because it was gone, but because the system had chosen not to write it down. The Manilamen were not passive occupants of a marsh. They were the dominant fish suppliers to New Orleans. In 1860, Spanish fishermen killed 2 Manilamen in a violent dispute over access to the market at Proctorville, a campaign to monopolize the fish trade and control the flow of seafood to the city. The newspaper sided with the Filipino fishermen, who outnumbered the Spanish and supplied significantly more fish to market. New Orleans took their side because New Orleans needed them. 5 years after the Civil War, on July 24, 1870, the Spanish-speaking residents of Saint-Malo founded the Sociedad de Beneficencia, the first Filipino social club in American history, a mutual aid society, organized and operating in a country that had legally barred their women from entering, that had no racial category for their children, and that would not publish its first article about their existence for another 13 years. They organized anyway. A community that the law had tried to prevent from forming had formed anyway, and had formalized its existence in writing, in the same administrative language the empire had taught them, 5 years after the war that was supposed to have resolved the question of who in America was entitled to organize. The culinary legacy is still in the pot. Cajun and Creole cuisine expert John Folse described dried shrimp to the BBC. You see, it was almost like a gift that just kept on giving through the season when everything else was out. We could always count on the fact that we had preserved that particular ingredient. He added, When I think of it, I think, my God, what in the heck would we have done without it? Louisiana cuisine as it exists today would be missing an ingredient that traces directly to the Manilamen's drying platforms. And so would the coastline, the stilt houses that lined the Louisiana coast, the fishing camps, the raised structures over the marsh that define the visual landscape of coastal Louisiana, trace their design logic to the houses the Manilamen built at Saint-Malo and Manila Village. Environmental educators have documented that other wetland communities adopted the Filipino practical style of stilt structures until the coast assumed its present look. The architecture of the Philippine coast became the architecture of the Louisiana coast. Not because anyone acknowledged it, because it worked. What strikes me about that specific inheritance, the stilt houses descending from Nipa huts through 2 centuries of construction without anyone naming the source, is that it is the most honest possible record of influence. The houses don't care whether the attribution was preserved. They just kept being built the way the Manilamen built them. The racial law could not erase what the Manilamen built. Something older and less preventable did that. In 1915, Saint-Malo was completely destroyed by the New Orleans hurricane of that year. According to descendants, some Manilamen stayed in what remained for many years. They rebuilt. They moved to Manila Village. And then 50 years later, in 1965, Hurricane Betsy completely destroyed Manila Village. The ruins have receded into the water in recent years and are now no longer visible even at low tide. 2 villages, 2 hurricanes, 50 years apart. Everything the Manilamen built physically is underwater, but Ronda Richoux is still in St. Bernard Parish. In 25, the descendants of the Madriaga and Bourtanog families held a reunion in a camp with stilt houses of the same design as Saint-Malo. In 2019, a historical marker was finally erected for Saint-Malo 136 years after Hearn's article, at least 180 years after the village was built. Dr. Randy Gonzalez of the Philippine-Louisiana Historical Society, we want the histories of the communities of Saint-Malo and Manila Village to be integrated into the Louisiana story everyone knows. The next generation shouldn't be surprised when they learn there was a Filipino fishing village in St. Bernard Parish. The scale of that gap becomes fully visible in a single detail. In 25, Filipino workers arrived in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina to work in hospitality and healthcare. They had no idea they were walking into the city where their ethnic community had been established for 150 years before anyone in America had published a single word about Filipinos. What 250 years of presence and invisibility in the same place means is not a complicated story. The Manilamen were not hidden by anything they did. They were not hidden by any failure of their community. They were hidden by where every documentation system consistently pointed its attention toward what the official categories could process, and away from a stilt village in a mosquito-infested alligator swamp where nobody with other options would go. The record wasn't wrong about what it found. It was selective about where it looked. When Lafcadio Hearn sailed into the Marsh in 1883, he wrote as if he was discovering something. He hadn't discovered anything. He had just finally looked in the right direction. The Manilamen had been there the whole time. In the swamp, in the gumbo, in the architecture of every stilt house on the Louisiana coast, in the DNA of families with Cajun names and Filipino grandparents, in the dried shrimp that Cajun chefs say they couldn't cook without, just below the surface, waiting for someone to finally write it down. Filipinos are documented as the oldest continuous Asian American settler community in North America. They were in Louisiana before the Civil War, before the Transcontinental Railroad, before the Chinese Exclusion Act, and before anyone in America had written a single word about what it meant to be Asian in this country. If you know someone who grew up in Louisiana, who thinks they might have Cajun ancestry they can't fully account for, or who has ever eaten dried shrimp in a gumbo, send them this. The Manilamen were in that bowl. They were just never credited for it. Subscribe. There are more stories like this one. I cannot stop finding them. I would rather not do it alone. Thanks for watching.